Well, hi, everybody. It's so great to see so many familiar faces, and I'm really pleased to introduce our speaker today. My name is Kathy Perenick-McLean. I am the Director of Employment and Training at Caledon Community Services. I'm happy to include our Executive Council and Partnership Table co-chairs to this special session. As a co-chair of the Service Delivery Network, SDN, lots of acronyms, and innovative incubator group of agencies in Peel as part of the Peel Newcomer Strategy Group. We have been considering digital and hybrid service delivery within and among our agencies. And we saw strong alignment that came from the Executive Council IRCC Planning Day consultation forum in February with relates to digital and hybrid improvements. Today, we have with us Marco Campana, a consultant who you may know as he's been in the sector for almost 30 years. His experience has been in creating and managing the settlement at site work, launched by OCASI Learn at Work online learning site for sector workers, and has participated in a number of efforts to create a sector community of practice, leading the digital social media strategy work at Maytree, and most currently works as a freelance consultant, helping agencies harness technology in client service delivery. His current focus is on digital transformation, supporting settlement practitioners to develop digital literacy skills, knowledge mobilization, and digital inclusion equity. Marco co-authored an IRCC-funded National Steering Committee on Technology, a report released this month with key considerations for effective hybrid services. The report, titled "The Future is Now: Strengthening High Quality, Inclusive, and Innovative Hybrid Service Delivery," uses recommendations highlighted during the past 2 years to lay the groundwork for strategic work nationally and regionally. We hope this session will be one of the stepping stones for our broad group of IRCC-funded agencies to find further alignment with the National Strategy Report to help us prioritize for regional collaboration. So over to you.
Thank you so much, and thanks so much for having me, everyone. Before I dive in, I just want to say that I'd love for this to be as interactive as possible. So no pressure about cameras. I'm happy to have them on, off, whatever you're comfortable with. I know a lot of people are sick of looking at their own faces in these Zoom meetings. But I do want you to, at any point, jump in, raise a hand. The easiest way is, because I'm going to be sharing my screen for most of this, if you use the reactions at the bottom of Zoom, that'll sort of pop up a notification and I'll know that someone wants to say something. But if I miss you, unmute and have at it and interrupt me. I'm quite comfortable with that, and we'll sort of go from there. So the goal today, I'm going to share my screen and we'll dive in, is really to kind of look at where are we at and where are we going when it comes to hybrid digital service delivery, and in particular where you're at in Peel Halton region in particular. So I want to start by actually interacting with you. So we're going to start with you. I have some questions and some interactions. We're going to use Mentimeter and Google Jamboard, so in and out of Zoom, to sort of get a sense of where you're at as an organization when it comes to hybrid service delivery, things you're working on, and how you're kind of feeling about everything. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about what we've learned at the national level in the report that Kathy just mentioned and some of the other work that's been done, how that aligns with local themes and priorities that you've expressed in some of your meetings and some of your own research, for example, in your regions. And then I'm going to walk you through a little bit about what I know of where work is being done on these themes and these priorities, and where you can become part of those. And then I'm going to get you to share what you're working on in those areas as well, because I certainly don't know everything. And then at the end, we want to sort of talk about who should lead all of this, right? What does that look like? Who's supposed to be doing what? And by that, I'm talking about from the national to the regional to the provincial, national, provincial, regional, and the local level, right in your organization. So really kind of having the conversation about, are we waiting for someone to help us lead? How can we lead? What does that actual mix look like? And because we're not completely sure, that's part of our conversation. And I want to kind of end with that and leave that with you, but also have that discussion about where your perspective is on that. So to start with, we're going to jump in the chat. This is the first question I have, and I will put a link to this in the chat. You should, when you click on this link, see a screen that looks like what's on the screen here in front of me. And I just want you to take a few minutes to kind of look at when you're thinking about your organization and when you're thinking about how you're transitioning as an organization to the hybrid service delivery model. Do you feel like your organization is currently really still just surviving? You're just getting by. You're still trying to figure this out. We're just coming out of some of the purely digital and remote work we did during the pandemic. You've got newcomers a little bit involved, but we're just having this conversation. Or are you kind of more in the middle? You're striving, right? You're planning and you're talking about how this work is changing. You've got some medium-term goals. You have some ideas. You're talking about what remote work looks like in your organization, how you can involve newcomers more actively in the service design. Or are you thriving? Are you in an organization, you've got this strategy figured out, you know exactly where you're headed, you've implemented remote work, newcomers are heavily involved in the service planning and things like that. So just take a few minutes and I'm going to switch my screen to look at what that looks like from a perspective. Okay, great. So right now, so this is you voting. There's 13 of you who have voted, and I think, how many do we have in the audience? There's 29 of you. So I've got a count on the bottom right. So right now, 2/3 of you are striving. Some of you are still just surviving, and a few of you are thriving, which is really interesting. So please continue. This is really just to give me and yourselves a sense of where you and your colleagues are at when it comes to hybrid service delivery. Okay, so there's 22 of you who have voted. Thank you. If I'll give you a few more seconds for those who haven't voted yet. Once again, just in the chat, click on that link, and it should give you a sense. Really, is do you feel like you're kind of just figuring this stuff out? And I would say that most organizations are in the striving. We're still trying to figure this out. We're doing some planning. We've got some medium-term goals. We're getting there. Very few are in the thriving. Very few are at what I would call the stage of high-level digital maturity. And definitely important to acknowledge that some are still just surviving. Some are still just trying to figure this all of this out. So that's super helpful. Thank you everyone for participating in that. That is useful to know, and I'll share that back with Jessica and the team after as well. The next is to talk a bit about what you're working on. So really for me to just have a sense, and again, Jessica shared some of the results from the survey that she sent out last week pre this session, but to figure out what kinds of digital projects or hybrid service delivery projects are you working on, what challenges you're experiencing, and what benefits are you experiencing. And we're going to do that in a Google Jamboard. So I'm going to put this link in the chat. And the way a Google Jamboard works, if you haven't used it before, basically this is a whiteboard and we're using sticky notes. So once you join, you see I've pre-populated it with a number of things that people shared in the survey. So on the left, we have a list of the projects, on the right, some of the challenges, and the bottom right, benefits that you feel you're experiencing from hybrid work. To add to this, simply click on the left where the toolbar is, click on sticky note, then you'll notice the sticky note pops up. You can change the color, you can type in it. So I'll just put this as a test sticky note. Once you've put it, once you've entered it, you can move it around. You can go back in and edit it, including changing, let's say, oh, this is actually a benefit or a challenge, so I'm going to move it back over here, and then you can always delete it. So you can talk about this out loud, you can unmute yourself, you can throw some stuff in the chat, or you can jump into the Jamboard. But I'm just curious where people are at in terms of the projects and efforts you're working on in your organization, and some of the challenges and benefits you're experiencing from that work. So like I said, if you're in the Jamboard, great. If you're more comfortable unmuting or throwing something into the chat, that's fine too. But of the things that are here, are there other projects that people are working on that they'd like to share? Don't all jump in at once. Like I said, if it's easier, yeah, don't move that whole thing. Don't delete that. If it's easier to just unmute and you want to share it about a project, go ahead. I hear someone's mic.
I can jump in. It's Sue from Access. We had a bit of an advantage going into COVID with having set up pre-arrival services and migrated 6 of our many bridging programs into virtual delivery in 2015. And we're continuing to grow our pre-arrival reach with a new IRCC funded program called Connecting Canada. And I would say that the benefits to that, both then and now, is just the opportunity to remain on this learning curve and to continue to test and explore and tweak new platforms that work best in this space. And as I said, we were really fortunate in that, you know, long before COVID hit, we knew how to do mock interviews online and how to do job fairs online and how to set up virtual interviews and connect employers with people in different parts of the world. So that's the big one. And of course, you know, as a result, all of our programs are now hybrid. And I'm not sure, you know, is that what you're looking for, Marco? Or?
Absolutely. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
You've given me a few good, you've given me and others a sense of some of the projects you're working on, as well as some of the benefits. All of those are useful. And other people are putting in some photo voice program, helping newcomers document their journey. Really interesting stuff. Source the best equipment for a hybrid classroom. Absolutely. Those things are so important to try to figure out what's the right equipment. Challenges of VPN and connectivity. When I say, oh, good question. So there's a question, when I say hybrid, do I mean something different from blended? In this context, I'm using them interchangeably. So blended tends to be the language that comes out of our language side of the sector, and hybrid is something that's sort of a bit more generic. So when I say hybrid, I mean either or, so hybrid and blended, a similar kind of approach. Yeah, I hope that answers the question. So understanding what equipment, a challenge of understanding what equipment will be the best option for clients. Absolutely. Yeah, I think that's something that comes up quite frequently. Okay, great. So I answered that question well. Reaching out to newcomers and the access and use of technology. So when you're talking about reaching out, does that mean in terms of actually getting to reach newcomers and find them and bring them in as clients, for example? Feel free to unmute whoever posted that. And while we're waiting, so under benefits, opportunity, okay, save tax dollars by collaborating across agencies. Referrals could be done more efficiently on digital platforms. We could put energy into those who need it most. I feel like you've been listening to some of my presentations. I completely agree. And I think that those are some of the conversations we need to be having, right? And when we talk about hybrid, I haven't defined it for you here, but it's really, well, we'll talk about it a little bit later, but it is a mix of services, right? Partially online, partially in person, or completely in person and completely online, all client-centered, depending on the client. So the idea of being able to have digital for those who are digitally savvy or digitally illiterate or have the devices and aren't part of the digital divide and are self-directed, and being able to provide them with sort of self-directed resources perhaps can give you more time to spend with those who might need a little bit more support. So I feel like we've kind of, thank you for those who added and for unmuting. I'm going to jump ahead to the next one, which is a final one, which is our perceptions. So there's a few things that I like to talk about that are kind of myth busting in some ways. So this is the next Mentimeter. I'm going to move my slides ahead so that if you're on the Mentimeter screen, you should now see that we've shifted to another one. And it'll ask you, do you want to go to the slide, which will take you here. So what's on this screen, basically, there's 7 questions and there's sort of 2 measurements. And what I want to get a sense of are what you think, how true you think some of these statements are, and how certain you are of that truth or whether they're true or not. So for example, you know, the statement, we have the communities of practice or places to get and share information in our sector. You could say, yeah, absolutely. I'm completely sure of that. Or that's completely true, and I'm completely sure of that. Or you could say, yeah, I think that's true, but I'm not completely certain. So you can see you have a 1 to 5 range on either side of the scale. So if you're completely certain, you would go up to the all the way. Thank you, Jessica. And if you if you're not sure it's true, you're slightly certain that it's true, or you're uncertain that it's true, basically going that way with it. And then when you get to the bottom, you would click submit. And what we'll see on our screen is things will start to populate here. So it's basically go through each statement and say, okay, so we want to and we will share, collaborate, network, and learn together if we just had the space for it. Yeah, 100% true, 100% certain, or yeah, that's not totally true in my experience, and I'm very certain that that's not true. So it's kind of like along those lines. What's your perception of whether it's true or not? How true do you think it is? And how certain are you of how true it is? So again, if you're able to jump in to the Mentimeter. And thank you, Jessica, for sharing the link again in the chat. Let us know what you're thinking about some of these items. It'll take a few minutes. Okay, perfect. Some of you are already there. So you can see, for example, this person is thinking professional network development is hard to access. Very true, sort of true, but very certain of I'm not totally sure, right? Whereas with number one, I'm neither certain about nor uncertain, and I'm not sure if it's true or false. So this is fantastic. This is the kind of thing, it's important for us to figure out some of the things we talk about. So for example, newcomers are more digitally literate than you are. Hybrid service delivery is either or in person. And what you'll see when I mouse over is it shows the different points and then kind of the mid-range of where people have voted. So we have a lot of differences in the room on some of these, which is fantastic to see the nuances and the diversity in what we think about and how certain we are about some of these things. So I'll let you go at that for another few minutes. I love this live. It's fun to see things move around. Feels like it's alive. This is so great. So you can see how diverse the opinions are as I mouse over each one of them. All of those are people's points of votes and how certain and how true or false they think it is. And almost all of them just run the entire spectrum, which is really, really interesting, except for this one, which is quite interesting. This one is a little bit more tight in the certain and true pile for most of you. So that's really fascinating to see these trends as they're happening live. So there's 20 of you who have gone through the questions. I'll give the rest of you I know there's 7 questions. It's a lot to pour over, so I'm going to give you a few more minutes to play with it. Awesome. I'm going to let the rest of you keep voting, but I want to just kind of go over some of what I'm seeing and some of where I hear some of these assumptions, for example. So this is really interesting to see that we're not quite certain, but we think it's true. We think it's sort of true, but we're not totally certain that we do have the communities of practice or places where we can get together. And that's really important. And we're going to, in more detail, I'll be going into each of these areas in the following presentation, but that's really interesting to see. So every frontline worker is a digital navigator or digital champion now. It's part of our jobs. Look, this is an incredible mix. We're slightly certain that it's somewhat true, right, is the way I would interpret this. But a lot of you are quite certain it's false or you're not sure. But there's some strength in false. If we look on the left-hand side, right, we've got 2 false, but not necessarily certain, 2 very certain that are false, but a lot of people who think it's true and they're quite certain about that. Really interesting. We want to and will share, collaborate, network, and learn together if we just had the space for it. Again, a lot of people are certain that's true, but a few of you are not certain. And I think that's really important. Some of you think it's true, but you're uncertain. Really interesting, again, to see that. And when we jump over to agencies should wait for regional, provincial, and national networks, it's false for most of you. Most of you are quite certain that's false, so you don't want to wait to be led, right? And that's going to be part of our conversation at the end. So what are the implications if you shouldn't be waiting? What does that mean for how we work as individual agencies and how we work as networks around that? And in your case, I'm thinking of the regional network, right? What role, if we're not going to wait for networks, what role do we have to play then in leading them to where we want to go, right? The bottom-up kind of approach. That's a really important conversation for us to continue to have. Professional development is hard to access. It seems false, but we're not sure. We're hedging our bets here. Some of you are very certain that that's false. Some of you think it's false, but you're not sure. So it's a really interesting mix to see here. because this comes up a lot and we hear it a lot in the sector, is that I just don't know where to go to get training, and I don't know what training I need, for example. And that's really interesting to see that, again, there's quite a diversity of opinions here. So hybrid service delivery is either or, in person or digital online. And again, I may not be mixing the words very well here, but the attempt here is to say, basically, does hybrid mean that a person will either access in person or online, or does it mean that they could do both? Right? So are we providing hybrid service delivery who's someone who might come in for the intake and assessment and then start accessing services online, but next week might want to come and meet their counselor one-on-one face-to-face, might want to access a workshop, and the week after access a webinar or an online course, for example. So it's figuring out, what does that mix look like? I'm going through this exercise with a client right now, and what we're seeing is within every program, it's an incredible diversity. So within a language program, for example, they've talked to their clients, they've talked to their staff, they've looked at what's worked over the last 2 years, and for one group, it's 100% going online. But within that group, there are childcare needs, and people can be unfocused when they're accessing it. So they're actually going to have people come into a space where they access the course online and they have childcare available, right? That's the definition of hybrid in many ways. It's a combination of in-person along with online. So they're literally going to be on a computer in an office space, and there'll be admin support around them, and their children can go into childcare while they're taking that class. And then another group is completely assured that they want to access their language classes in person, and they need childcare. So that course is going to have a reverse mix of 3 days, but the online was working during the pandemic. So they're going to have 3 days of in-person with childcare and 2 days of online. And what will be important for them is figuring out what's that mix of what are the activities that lend themselves more to in-person and what are the activities that lend themselves more to online. So it's really looking at that incredible diversity in that mix. And then for the last one, newcomers are more digitally literate than you are. So most of you are fairly certain you're a little bit certain that it's a little bit false. And this is something, we're not going to spend a ton of time in this, but it's demonstrably true, right? And our experience is that newcomers are in fact more digitally literate than we are as organizations. And we've seen those trends over the years. Now, that doesn't mean every newcomer is, right? And that's where the nuance comes in. We've seen this in the research. We've seen this in IRCC's own research. We've seen this anecdotally at agencies where people were shocked that when they've started to talk to clients, they want to do some of it online still. And the nuance that I'm hearing from people is the stuff that they, both staff and clients and newcomers, want to do in person. They want to do that initial intake and assessment, some of them in person, and staff in particular want to, because they want to see that person. They want to experience that person and all of their body language and their tone. They don't want to just see the from the chest up kind of thing on a video screen. And newcomers in particular crave the social and community connections and those kinds of interactions that happen somewhat serendipitously, not even if they're planned in an in-person environment. So you go in, you have your workshop, you have your class, you do your learning, and then you meet other newcomers, and maybe you go for a walk with them, you go to the cafe, you have some tea with them. It happens during and after the class, and that's much more difficult to do when it's a transactional online service like a webinar. The webinar's over and we all kind of go our separate ways. So they want that, but at the same time, they see after I can get the social connections, after I've done the intake and I actually kind of build some trust and understand who this service provider is, I'm happy to do a job search workshop online. The transactional services give me the knowledge while I'm at home and I've got kids running around, or I can access a recording of your webinar at 2 a.m. after I've done my 2 jobs and I put the kids to bed, and now is the time when I can access services at a time that's convenient for me, for example. So we really need to kind of, when I say that this is actually true, it's true with lots of caveats and nuances, right? Because the research shows us, in particular, when I talk about newcomers, I don't just mean clients, right? This is one of the other conversations we need to have as a sector. When we talk about newcomers, we tend to mean clients. And those are only about 40 to 50% of the newcomers who actually, are eligible for our services. The rest are not accessing our services. And what we can see around us are incredible networks and WhatsApp groups and Facebook groups and Viber groups and WeChat groups and online Web 1.0 directories of newcomers sharing and talking about information together. They're doing this in parallel to our services, and they're doing it increasingly using technology in ways that we don't even access or know are happening. So super interesting to see all of you here. Thank you so much for everyone participating. I want to dive back in. Any questions before I kind of blah, blah, blah at you for the next little while? Because I'm going to show you a bunch of kind of where things align now between the national research and your regional stuff, and what's being worked on in these spaces. Any reactions or thoughts about what we've kind of talked about so far? Please feel free to unmute yourself or raise a hand. No problem. Okay, so I'm going to keep going with the blah, blah, blah. So this is the national, these are themes from the national report that Kathy mentioned. So this was a National Steering Committee on Technology was struck earlier this year. They met for the first time at the end of March. And to support those efforts, the idea of the committee is basically to help the sector figure out what's a roadmap for the next 2 years, essentially, because we're heading to the national call for proposals in 2024-25. And so these are the big themes that came out. And the idea with the report to support that was looking at, okay, we've done a bunch of research over the last 2 years. So there were about 6 reports that IRCC mainly funded that looked at questions of innovation, questions of hybrid service delivery, as well as pre-arrival service delivery for refugees in particular, and what that could look like using technology. And the 4 themes that emerged were that the sector is to work on in partnership with IRCC and other funders is the idea of strengthening the hybrid service environment. We need a vision and a strategy. We need to focus on digital skills and literacy, both for staff and organizations, but also for newcomers. Service providers need infrastructure development when it comes to information technology, as well as new positions even, and a cultural shift in how we look at the way we do our work, basically. Another theme was looking at enabling innovation and the idea that we need to both have an innovation mindset, so we're testing, we're experimenting, but also funding models that support that kind of an approach, right? So a good example is the pandemic itself. We had a much more flexible relationship with funders where we had to change and pivot all the time based on what we were learning about our clients and their access to digital and their ability to use digital and their preferences around digital. And so we had to be questioning and trying things out and learning and pivoting and changing. And the reality is that we need to be able to continue to do that moving forward, and we need flexible models, funding models to help us do that. But we also need to be able to use data and develop data skills more, because by data, we're talking about it with newcomers. What do we understand about newcomers? What do we know about them, their preferences for communication, their preferences for services, what works, what their digital divide is. And so it's figuring out at the organizational level how we become better at not just collecting, because everybody collects a lot of data, but at harnessing, analyzing, and using data to inform our service design. At the bottom is mobilizing knowledge. This is like a theme that has been around for decades in our sector. We need to prioritize and streamline how we collaborate and share information, right? This isn't new to anybody. We've been talking about this for many, many years. And on the left is the idea of we want to continue to ensure that we have high quality and inclusive services. So the part of what the report talked about is another, we've talked about this in the sector for years, advocating to IRCC about expanding the notion of who's eligible for services, right? We know that increasingly people with temporary status, in particular international students, temporary foreign workers, are looking towards pathways towards permanency. I think with international students, they estimate that between 30 and 50% of international students are trying to become permanent residents eventually, or after 10 years have permanent residency status. Well, we're up to 600,000 international students a year in this country. That's 300,000. That's almost equal to our yearly intake of permanent residents, right? Their target is 400,000. So we're talking about 700,000 people each year who are becoming permanent residents, and we can only serve half of them, right? The 400,000. So what happens? Well, we know what happens in the quality of the settlement for international students. It's problematic, right? If we could get interventions to them sooner, perhaps their outcomes could be better. And then looking at service accessibility as well. And by accessibility in this case, we're talking about 24/7. accessing services and information based on a newcomer's preferences. So that person I mentioned who can't come to you during the day, can't attend a webinar live, but can access your recordings, access your information, email or message you asynchronously, so not in real time, and get that information. That's still a legitimate form of accessing services if it's the only way it works for them. And ensuring that everything we do is newcomer centered, right? We've done a lot of work in our sector to center newcomers in our work. And sometimes we forget that. We just know how to do things, so we just keep doing it the way we do them. And there's a lot more work we can do around what it means to be newcomer centered. And the reality is when you look at what I like to call, or what people call friction in service delivery, people will not stand for friction anymore because they don't have it in other aspects of their lives, right? Think of the Amazon, right? I want something, I'll get it tomorrow if I'm signed up with Prime. There's no friction in that purchase for me anymore. I see it, I buy it, I get it. What does that look like for service delivery, right? So for example, if we're doing an intake that takes an hour and asks them for every possible question about them, is that friction in getting them towards the service? Or can we do an intake light where we get enough of the questions to move them into the next stage where they can do an assessment with somebody? And there are models emerging in our sector constantly around that. And then digital inclusion is part of this, right? It's something we were kind of aware of pre-pandemic, but it's something we're hyper aware of now. There's a huge digital divide amongst some newcomer groups and nuances within those groups, and we have a role to play in that. So that's where the national perspective comes in. Now, I looked at notes that Jessica shared me from your Peel Halton IRCC planning day in February, and I want to talk about how all of these things are aligned. So you're saying some of the same things, and kind of facetiously, it didn't surprise me because the work that all these projects did over the last 2 years were incredibly consultative, right? Surveys, interviews, focus groups, including some focus groups in Peel and surveys from folks here. So it's not surprising that what you're talking about as priorities are what we're hearing at the national level, because we came and we spoke to everybody. So when it comes to strengthening the environment, you want standardized intakes. You want to prioritize privacy, confidentiality, and security across these digital platforms, incredibly essential. And you want to figure out how do we implement and increase these hybrid models for service delivery. When it comes to enabling innovation, universal data collection came up in your notes, and building community needs assessment strategies. Those strategies are useful only if they're built on the data, right? And again, we need to expand that notion of data, not just from clients, but from newcomers kind of writ large, right? So we're not just saying, oh, these are the needs of newcomers, when what we mean is these are the needs of our clients. When it comes to knowledge mobilization, similarly, you're talking about, we want resource sharing mechanisms. We want them at the regional and the provincial, perhaps the national level, so that we can share what we're learning, we can share what we're doing, but we can learn from others as well. And then when it comes to the idea of high quality and accessible services, a big piece of that is helping clients with technology, supporting our frontline workers to ensure that they are increasingly not falling victim to the digital divide, for example, right? So ensuring that they have the access to the skills, to the technologies, to the internet, to the devices, and the support that they need in order to access not just hybrid and digital services from immigrant and refugee serving organizations, but increasingly in the rest of their lives, whether it's banking or access to government or access to healthcare. All of these things are increasingly digital. And again, prioritizing privacy, security, confidentiality in all of this. And that comes up very much in the frameworks in the reports from the national level. So where is this being worked on? When I talk about this stuff, so sorry, before I go on, any questions about these interlinked priorities? I would say to you that your priorities are the sector's priorities, and what we're hearing from the sector is what we're hearing from you, obviously with certain nuances and certain additional priorities that you will define as you're moving forward. But one of the things that we talked about in one of the reports, and is mentioned again in the national, is this idea of baseline competencies, right? So the idea with a model moving forward is that no agency, no worker, no executive director, no manager or leadership should fall below a certain baseline of specific competencies, abilities, and access to technology in order to do their work. And that will look very different in different communities, right? So for example, Costi has an internal IT department, they have a communications department, and I spoke to a one-person shop in rural Saskatchewan. They're never going to have that kind of infrastructure, but what could they have access to in terms of IT support, communication support, that could be shared regionally? Maybe it's a person who kind of travels between agencies, for example. There are different models that we've seen that exist now, right? you can hire someone who's called a fractional marketing officer. They literally are your chief marketing officer, but they work for 15 different organizations, and you get them a few hours out of every month, for example. So you're not hiring a staff person, you're getting a piece of somebody. And what if that person only worked with other immigrant and refugee serving organizations? Not only would they understand everybody, but they could also leverage and bring what they're learning from one organization to another, build those networks, build those mobilization networks and things like that. Cassandra mentions in the chat, we should weave cybersecurity into the model development from day one and anticipate risks proactively. Absolutely, 100%. That's in all of those reports when we talk about the digital frameworks, and the vision and strategy has to include those elements. Absolutely right. Thank you for mentioning that. Those things are incredibly important, and when we lack the literacy and we lack the technology in many cases in our sector for that. And interestingly, we would find that some newcomers lack that as well, and others are hyper aware. In particular, people who have gone through a refugee experience where they've traveled through multiple countries with their smartphones, they know they're being surveilled. They know they're being targeted, geolocated, for example. They are very aware of the risks with insecure communication and the need for privacy and things like that. And they look to us to ensure that we understand those as well. So where's this being worked on? I like to consider this a bit of an iceberg where much of it is happening below the surface. It's happening in places we don't always see. We don't always know what's going on. And what we usually only see are what I call the visible uses of technology. So Zoom, email, WhatsApp, things like that. We see what's being used and we see what's out there. And I say IRCC's future vision, which I'll introduce in a few minutes, is partially below the surface. We don't completely know, but they've told us a little bit. So a little bit of it is above the surface, for example. So when we're looking at strengthening the hybrid service environment, the first thing I want to mention to people is this is not a new conversation, right? And just to let you know, in the slides, each one of these is linked. So you see the source and the reference material. I'm not going to click on most of these links, but for you to have them, you'll get them when I share the presentation with Jessica, and she'll share with you. But this, for example, this very robust looking model about interactive online career development services, 2012, right? I did a presentation with Maitri about with a colleague of mine, an ex-colleague of mine, 5 good ideas for building your services online, 2008. The virtual care equity matrix, relatively new, 2021, but that comes out of e-health, online health, which has existed for more than a decade. We fumbled that one multiple times in Ontario, there's no doubt about it, but it exists, it's happening. And what people are realizing is we can't talk about virtual care or e-health without equity and inclusion in it. So this gives us certain models that we can borrow. In 2018, NetHope, which is an international humanitarian organization that supports the digital evolution and transformation of other international humanitarian organizations, so like the Red Cross and these big groups that you see on the news when there's a disaster, they came up with this model that looks at all of these things: people, process, technologies, data, investment, and readiness. And all of these are the components that are needed for digital transformation. So I recently kind of took that and said, well, what does that look like? Whoops. What does that look like from a digital settlement agency? So this is basically their elements. So people means professional development. What are these competencies that we need, that we have? What are the frameworks for knowledge mobilization? When we look at the processes, we're talking about those digital and data maturity, but also those risk frameworks. Like you mentioned, Cassandra, the need for privacy security. We need risk frameworks means what are the risk implications of the work that we're doing, for example, and how can we make sure that our work doesn't have all of these risks? When we look at technology, for us, that we need to ensure that any technology we use and choose aligns with digital inclusion and equity, that it is imbued with the sector values of access, anti-oppression, and inclusion, for example, right? So those are our baselines, right? If we go back to the virtual care matrix, that's an important piece of ensuring that we address the digital divide before we do anything, right? It's the foundational piece. So for us, digital inclusion, ensuring that if we're going to go this way, people can access the services in the way that they need to. When we look at data, we're talking about the newcomer at the center here, right? Everything we do is based on what we understand of newcomers, and making sure that, and I've said this in other presentations, creating a seamless experience for them. right? When we're talking about investment, I always like to reference Maitrey, the Maitrey Foundation's Alan Broadbent, who talks about the 3 I's of immigrant integration, right? We need to be intentional about what we're doing, which means we need to be strategic. We need to have the instruments to help us carry out that intention. So those are the strategies, but also the tools, or the Zooms, right? The hybrid service vision. But then we need the investments. We need the funding to make sure all of that can actually happen. And then when it comes to being ready, these are the baselines that I spoke to earlier. We can't be ready if we're all at different places along the digital maturity spectrum. We have to identify one place where we all must at least be, the floor, if you will, and exceed that to your heart's content, right? So in this room right now, for example, Access Employment has exceeded that. They're at a high level of digital maturity, and some of you are just surviving, as we saw from that first poll, right? We need to make sure that people who are surviving are at least being moved into striving, if not thriving eventually, right? We need to make that happen so that no one in the future says, I'm surviving. That's a huge red flag at this point for us. And we need to understand what that looks like from our perspective. So interestingly, there are some really neat projects that are happening out there. So just emerging is the Canadian Centre for Nonprofit Digital Resilience, which, as you see on the left, is using that similar NetHope model, which is what I based on to create this. So we're kind of aligned. You can see their priorities in their focus areas. Very interesting, very aligned with our sector vision, with the reports that have come out. Sector agencies were involved in the initial consultation for the creation of this center. Again, is it emerging? So we are at the table here. And if you see on the right, it talks about their holistic approach. All of those are priorities that we want to make sure are included and align once again with the work that we're seeing in the sector and the priorities that are coming out when we speak to service providers, for example. So this is a national platform, cross-sectoral, that we can connect to. And we can lead where we have knowledge and expertise, and we can learn from other sectors where they have that knowledge and expertise. So we're not alone in this. That's really important as well, that there are networks that are out there for us. And then again, digital inclusion is at the core of everything. So digital inclusion typically means access to devices, access to high-speed internet. In Canada, that means a download speed of 50 megabytes and an upload speed, I believe, of 10. That's what the CRTC designates as acceptable bandwidth. And increasingly, as you move into rural areas, that's where it becomes more problematic, but also even in some urban areas, some communities don't have access. But then it's also the ability to use that technology. And by ability to use, we're talking not just about digital literacy, but also digital fluency and digital citizenship. And what I mean there is I can pick up my phone and I can post to Facebook. So I'm kind of digitally literate, but I'm not digitally fluent. I'm not sure about the security and privacy implications of using Facebook in my life. I'm not able to use these technologies in my work. I'm able to kind of just bare bones use some technology. And digital citizenship is, again, being very aware, helping to drive policies, voting for policies that support our privacy, security, confidentiality, encryption, things like that. So there's a continuum even on digital literacy that we want to make sure people have the bare bones skills, but we also want to make sure they have skills for employability, skills for accessing healthcare, and all of those things. And then there's the capacity of our sector, of our ability to help people access technology, whether it's hardware. Many of you became digital lending libraries during the pandemic, may continue that, whether it's advocating for and providing and ensuring our clients who may be low income have access to the programs that can get them connectivity, whether it's creating digital literacy programs ourselves or connecting with and providing referrals to people in the sector or in your community who are doing digital literacy training, but making that part of your work, and then building whatever the capacity needs to be within your own organization, whether it's a referral capacity or a service delivery capacity in that. We're also talking about the changing role of the frontline worker. So on the left, there was some research done in 2018 that looked at the general competencies of settlement workers, right? And they're a combination of working with newcomers and working with communities, right? We know this advocacy, trying to build welcoming communities while we're helping newcomers understand how to navigate systems. On the right is NetHope's digital nonprofit model of the skill pie of what it takes now for us as frontline workers. So digital responsibility, technical literacy. So digital responsibility is understanding the risks, right? This privacy, security. Technical literacy is being able to use the tools and help others use them. But you'll note that these other skill sets, right? Adaptive and collaborative, able to solve complex problems, being entrepreneurial. That means being innovative more than anything, and being creative, right? These are other aspects that are soft skills, right? So as we move forward in the digital space, we need a lot of soft skill development around this stuff and the space to be able to do that. And in the bottom is an emerging model called digital navigators, also known as digital champions. So digital navigators comes from the US, and digital champions comes from the UK, and they both work very similarly to essentially help address the digital literacy of people in the community. So you're creating surveys and assessments. You're creating action plans for people about how to increase their digital literacy, whether you provide the service directly or you refer them to other people, and then you find those supports. And digital navigators, that's the digital skills part. They may also be part of helping with connectivity, helping with equipment, for example. There's lots of different roles people can play, but at their core, what we're discovering is two things. One is that's a new role that's emerged in our sector. There are a number of organizations who have digital navigators as jobs right now, but it's also a part of everybody's job increasingly. So, inevitably, if you're working with clients, you have to help figure out how to onboard them onto the technology skills that you're using, or your digital navigator staff colleague will have to do that. But we have to understand technology, and we have to help newcomers understand technology, even if it's at the very level of don't email me your PR or SIN card. Why? Because that's not an insecure method of communication. We have a more secure method of communication, and here it is. So you have to understand that. You have to figure out how to communicate that effectively to someone who doesn't understand that and may have other linguistic challenges. And then you have to work with someone to make sure they understand doing that. That's all digital navigation. So in the same way that we do systems navigation, helping someone access employment or health or housing and understanding what those systems are like, we also are increasingly developing a digital navigation role in our work. And then in terms of community impact, this is the Tamarack model of community change. Community innovation is just one piece, right? But it's again going back to what we've learned around flexibility and funding. How do we test new approaches? How do we identify and amplify what works? That's knowledge mobilization. How do we increase collaboration? How can we bring people together and make sure that we're sharing and leading? And what are the right approaches to leadership in these spaces? We have the models. We don't have to reinvent them when we're talking about digital transformation or hybrid and service delivery. We can build on the way we do things already. So it's important for us to have a sense of IRCC's vision around this. This is the stuff above the iceberg that I told you about. This is from a presentation that they made probably over a year ago now. So we're not sure where their vision is completely because I haven't seen anything updated since then. But they're looking at, what is the vision? High quality online settlement services, and opt to complement those with in-person offerings. For me, there are some red flags in that language, right? It's online first, in-person second, and that's interesting, right? I don't know if they meant to do it that way, but they're talking about, settlement services online, and then you can opt for in-person. What we need to be talking about is like, what's that language actually need to look like? It's either or, it's both and. You will have a choice of what you want to access, and both of those need to be high quality. They want to see and help service providers they fund continue with their digital transformation, while again providing in-person services to those who need that additional support. So it was mentioned earlier, for people who really need, the more vulnerable, who need that time and space. And then understanding, what does a suite of digital settlement services look like? Whether that's going to be something, and the question here is, are we looking to IRCC to say, here's the portal, everybody use the portal now? Or are we developing our technologies and saying to IRCC, we will do the different things, the tasks. So we will have a video conferencing, we will have a client tracking tool, we will have email and digital messaging, but we will decide what that suite of digital services looks like and how we will implement them. So we're not sure where that conversation is going yet. What we do know is that, so this was meant to again be for this year and next, leading up to the call for proposals, that they will continue to do all of the things below to build the evidence base. In particular, what have we learned from service delivery improvement projects? How can we leverage lessons from pre-arrival programming? And how do we identify these, in particular, best practices on cybersecurity, privacy, and digital literacy, because that comes up constantly? And will they want to, in some ways, develop guidelines and standards for the CFP? They're also looking to support capacity through knowledge building. Now, none of these things are happening overtly and that we're aware of. Some of you may be in conversations with IRCC where they are, but it's problematic at this point to me that we don't know what IRCC is doing in all of these spaces, and we need to know more about that. right? We need to understand what they're focused on, because we haven't learned from SDI. We haven't had lessons from pre-arrival programming that have been shared sector-wide, for example. So this was IRCC's vision. We're already behind in some ways, and we need to figure out and poke and see where some of that will happen. So great example is we currently don't know what they funded for the latest round of SDI projects, and we only found out about the 2017 ones earlier this year. So that's a huge problem when it comes to knowledge sharing and mobilization. We need to know what we're all up to, right? So enabling innovation I realize I only have 10 minutes left, so I'm going to go really quickly. So enabling innovation for us means we need to define what we mean. We need to figure out what a vision and a definition of innovation is for the sector. And I just mentioned that we don't know what IRCC funded, but I found on the proactive disclosure part of the government website, which tells you what they funded. And I guessed based on project titles, what the SDI leveraging technology projects are. So you can click through this link, and there's 34 projects that they appear to have funded that are technology related, including at least one in your community. The other thing is figuring out things that we didn't think were possible that are now possible, right? So, if you suggested to someone pre-pandemic, let's move English assessment online, they would have laughed in your face. And then we did it, right? And maybe we haven't done it perfectly yet, but one element is newcomers can go and assess their English skills themselves. So there's the self-directed. Now, it doesn't have actual authoritative implications for what CLB level you'll get into, but it gives them a sense of where their English is at. And then this is a booking page from the YMCA, YWCA in the National Capital Region in Ottawa, where right now people can book an in-person assessment or an online assessment. Are there issues with some of this? Absolutely, right? If someone has a bad internet connection, it completely will blow the online assessment out of the water. So there's like below the iceberg digital literacy and digital divide issues around that. But the reality is that we've been able to be resilient and shift and morph and build systems to accommodate the realities of 2 years being fully digital. We've surprised ourselves in some ways around some of this stuff. The other thing is around data, right? We want more and more data. These are all examples of client relationship management systems that are sector specific. Some of them created by the sector, some of them created by companies to cater to the sector. So if you click through all of these, if you're not using one of them, if you're using OCMS or one of the other ones, they exist for you. These are robust, newer systems that will allow you to better track and analyze the data of your clients, at least. And increasingly, they're being built to not only talk to each other. So for a warm referral to another agency, for example, the model is the data will go with the client, right? With obviously all of their informed consent, with all of the privacy, so that when they get to that referral, they don't have to go through yet another whole intake. They just go through the 10 to 20% of the questions that are specific to that service. But the idea being efficiencies, but with the privacy of that data traveling. So the models are happening and they're being built, and we can work with what's out there. So enabling innovation and funding, right? So your PNSG is working on a regional accountability model for settlement. It's one of, I believe, 16 local immigration partnerships that are asking these similar questions. And some, like PNSG, are sharing more than others. So I've been able to find 3 of those 16 who are actually talking about their work online, and the rest are hopefully doing it, but not talking about it. And what I found is, among the 16, there's very little to no networking happening between them. So the model that you're working on in Peel may look incredibly different than what the one is in Toronto, but wouldn't it be interesting to find out where they are similar and where the outliers are and how we can learn from each other? So knowledge mobilization. But what it means is IRCC has funded this. IRCC is looking at different kinds of funding models. We also know that some of these innovations happen at the regional office level of IRCC. So there's a lot of interesting stuff happening in the Prairie and Northern Territories region around case management approaches, around defining agencies, or trying to break that barrier of competition. So in Calgary right now, for example, one agency, kind of like the language assessment, does all of the needs assessments for clients and then refers them to other agencies and does not deliver settlement services. So the idea there is there's no competition anymore because they're not doing that service, right? So is that a model that can help with competition? Is that a model that needs to be funded differently? There's lots of interesting innovation. We simply don't hear about it enough unless you're in a room at a conference at the right time when someone shares something, and maybe you get access to their PowerPoint slides after, right? So that's problematic, which brings us to mobilizing knowledge. So we're not sure if communities of practice. there's at least 10 that are out there that I'm aware of. We're not sure about where we can get professional development. Most of that already exists in the sector. It's run by a lot of umbrella organizations like OCASI, for example. But you can also access things like, LinkedIn learning for free through your local library, for example. It's still known as lynda.com there, right? So micro learning and micro credentialing is also something that we need to be becoming aware of. Instead of going to a college and paying $2,000 for a course, you can just learn what you need to learn in specific fits and starts. So if you're curious about developing a content strategy for your organization, take the 3-hour course on LinkedIn. It'll give you enough to start, right? We don't need to go high and pay, right? I mean, I know that the PET money, the professional education and training money in Ontario, is exhausted after 2 days after it's been announced. And so you can't always access the money, but there are increasingly low cost and no cost ways to learn that are based on kind of micro credentials, micro badges, where you're learning something you need to learn, and then you can kind of build on those things over time. There's also projects like the Pathways to Prosperity Sharing Settlement Integration Practices That Works, where they've taken an evaluation approach of programs and said, this is how this program is a good practice, and this is how you could learn and replicate from it. And I'm, total self-interest. I run a website called Knowledge Mobilization for Settlement, where I try to share interesting research, reports, good ideas, webinar recordings that you can access in a host of different areas. So when it comes to mobilizing knowledge, we have the mechanisms, we have the technologies. In fact, sometimes we have too many of them, right? So for example, settlenet.org kind of intersects with the CAMH one, which kind of intersects with the Newcomer Info Hub, which kind of intersects with, the Newcomer Navigation Network, where people are sharing somewhat similar things in those spaces. And so it's the question of, well, who does what? Where do I go to have this conversation? Do I have to join them all? So now we have too many, but people aren't using them effectively. Lots gets posted in those spaces, but not much conversation. So we're still missing something. It's not the technology, it's not the content. There's something missing in our ability to join and create communities of practice. Part of it is time, right? A frontline worker has to do it outside of their office hours. Part of it is comfort. Is IRCC in this space? How honest can I be? As well as maybe English isn't my first language, so am I comfortable expressing myself? Or will I feel like people are judging me if my language isn't perfect? Lots of reasons that we've looked at over time of why communities of practice haven't necessarily worked. So now the big question, and I apologize, we've got like 2 minutes. Who does what? Who needs to take the lead here? And I think that what came out strongly in your priorities is that and I'm going to stop sharing my screen here, is that it's regional, right? The organizations are taking the lead individually, but how do we ramp that up so that there's at least a regional conversation that's happening around some of these things? So I apologize, I've blabbed on for too long, but are there any thoughts about what next steps you need to take as a region in order to make sure that you're leading where IRCC might not be leading, where the sector might not be leading, so that you push it from the bottom up and say, not only is this what we need, but this is what we're working on, and this is what we've learned is working for us, but these are also the challenges that we have, that here's how we can address them, but here's how you need to help us address them, and here's how they need to be invested in order to address them more adequately. So I apologize for blabbing on, but the final thought is, how do you lead from the bottom up in this environment, or do you want to, and how do you do that collaboratively? Any thoughts? Anyone want to jump in?
Maybe I'll just jump in and just mention that we have a survey with executive council members that really shows that digital and hybrid is a priority among the respondents. So that's really exciting. And so it leads to maybe an ongoing conversation about this topic. We'll be looking at the survey results and then looking at how we can prioritize within that, some of those prioritized areas. And then it's going to lead towards our IRCC, what we're calling action days, November 3rd and 4th. So we might have the opportunity to bring Marco back to continue this discussion further in more depth and really try to think about that question about where do we want to go regionally if we want to collaborate in a certain area and really get some momentum made. I'm going to turn it to Kathy now, and thank you so much, Marco.
Yeah, sorry I didn't leave as much space at the end, but I hope that was useful.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much, Marco. I think my head is a little bit blown. I'm not going to lie. I just can't wait to go through this slide deck in detail and click on some of the links that you've shared for me. Very insightful. So I appreciate that. But I want to thank you on behalf of our group here, all the connections you've made for us and your insights. And I want to thank you for the whole group for joining. Definitely, let's continue this conversation through Executive Council, our partnership tables, and our LIP tables. So thank you all so much for joining in this. I really think I need to digest a lot of the information, but I very much appreciated, and I'm so glad that you all could join in today. And the conversation will continue. So thank you so much for everyone's time today, and I wish you all a fantastic day.
Thanks for having me, everybody.
Thank you so much, Marco. Bye.
Take care.